Hello, this tutorial is for just a real quick basic review of instability that most of you should already know. I just wanted to make sure that we're all on the same page and how PostureRay addresses this. So what I'm going to present is available in version 24/D25. You will know if you look at PostureRay, here's PostureRay here, but if you come up when you start up PostureRay, the version numbers here, as well as if you, in the very beginning too, just so you know, if we start up PostureRay, once it loads, the version numbers here on the main screen as well too, okay? So with that being said, let's go ahead and just review some of these basic tenets. Now, we go into this a lot within our whiplash trauma case. I present this for the ICA more in depth, obviously, as well as the CBP whiplash trauma case as well. These are some highlights from the presentation, and what's new and different here is we've updated PostureRay with this latest version to address some differences that a lot of users that really wanted to have a specific, just the way the AMA guides did it. On older versions, we did it more scientifically on certain points, and I'll point that out to you, is that there are some things that are done in AMA guides which biomechanically, especially according to Dr. Harrison, who's an actual real spine researcher, that it just doesn't make sense. And when I speak to some of my colleagues that know and have questioned some of the original authors directly on the AMA guides, they didn't have a very good explanation on how they derive some of this information. So hopefully in future guides, they can correct some of the stuff, but we're stuck with the way it is. Now, I'm going to go ahead and address some of those things, but I wanted you to know as we move forward. So basically, we all know if you're using PostureRay, you want to measure everything. So this slide is pretty self-explanatory. And many of you probably do not know how PostureRay came about. So originally, this is the precursor to PostureRay. Basically, it was a sonic digitizer on real films, and here's myself with Dr. Don Harrison, who was a PhD in mathematics, master's in mechanical engineering, and also had his chiropractic degree. So he wasn't just a typical chiropractor, right? And then this is his PhD advisor, who really was a rocket scientist. Literally, Dr. Tad actually had a PhD and worked for the government. And we like to say he was a real rocket scientist because he actually did work on projects like that. So with that being said, this is me digitizing on a whiplash case that we had. I believe that's what this one was for. Yeah, that's what the caption says. Where we're discriminating what happened in consecutive subjects that were exposed to whiplash type forces in our practice, basically a retrospective practice. But what we did with PostureRay is obviously make this a usable system on the computer. So that's how it came to be. Now, I wanted to, if you guys don't have this, is out of California, Management of Whiplash Associated Disorders. It's some nice things to be able to quote in case you're ever challenged on computerized mensuration. So the use of the X-ray digitizing received its first major support in the AMA, we already know that, and the computer-assisted digital methods are commonly used to calculate measurements of segmental motions, such as rotations and translations. And in PostureRay, we're going to note those as rotations using relative rotational angles and translations, segmental translations. If you're new and don't know the nomenclature, we probably have already reviewed that. If you're watching this, you've already been trained. With that being said, I'll just go ahead and read this to you. There are commercially available software programs that will compare subluxations at each level to normal and the percentage loss and gain from normal calculated automatically. Objectively measures spinal displacement for impairment ratings based on segmental instabilities using the AMA guides, whole body impairment, and allows the doctor to create an injury report showing the areas which are worsened with a personal injury or motor vehicle crash from the patient's pre-post injury films. So that's right in the guide. So if anybody ever asks you, well, doc, why are you doing this? There's credence for why we do this. Now, my advice to you is you do this, if you take x-rays on a patient across the board, you should do this on everybody, is my personal opinion. Because many patients have had traumas in their past, they just forget about them. So you should be measuring everything. If not with this system, you should be measuring in your PAC system. Or if you're still somehow using plain film, measuring by hand. because if not, you're missing things. So one of the things that people they really don't understand is really what is instability. If you were asked on the stand what is instability, this is the legit definition of what instability is. This comes from White and Punjabi, and it's a loss of the ability of the spine under physiological loads to maintain a relationship between a vertebra in such a way that there is neither damage nor subsequent irritation of the spinal cord or nerve roots, and in addition, there's no development of incapacitating deformity of pain due to structural changes. Now, the AMA Guides is based in part from this original paper. This is where older versions differed with PostureRay, because we know this is the real science here. The AMA Guides was an interpretation of the science. Unfortunately, my personal opinion and that of Dr. Deeds is they should use what the real research said, which was White and Punjabi. So this is where the 3.5 millimeters of displacement comes from, okay? And notice, let's read this verbatim. More than 3.5 millimeters of horizontal displacement from one vertebra in relationship to the adjacent vertebra measured on a lateral rhynchogram, okay? Resting, note that I'm pointing this out, resting, which is neutral, or flexion extension. Where I believe that this subtraction of flexion came from is flexion through extension was noted this way, and so they interpreted it as flexion minus extension, okay? Irregardless, it's in the guides clearly defined on how they do this. Biomechanically, researchers like Deed Harrison have a problem with this, because if you have normal stair stepping of, say, 1 to 2 millimeters, which could be classified as subluxation, you're within that realm of possibility that cumulative net movement shouldn't be classified as true instability as based on the guides. So that's our interpretation of it. But again, if you're using the guides, we updated PostureRay to go specifically with the guides when you're using the quote unquote end plate instability report. So now this is where they got the 11 degrees of rotation from the adjacent segments, okay? And notice it's on a resting lateral or flexion extension. Now, the reason why I bring this up, it's quite clear that for whatever reason, I'm not exactly sure how the AMA guides first say it does not apply to a neutral lateral. That's problem number one. Number two is that they take the flexion, they only want to rate angular movement on the flexion film. In our opinion, it should be also done on the extension, because we agree with White and Punjabi, who were the real experts. But again, I digress. It's the AMA guides. It's the standard. So if you're going to quote the AMA guides, you should do it the way the AMA guides did, or you have to note what you did differently in your narrative report and be very thorough in understanding that. So the AMA guides, White and Punjabi was clear. If you look at this X-ray, what position is their head? Their neck is in neutral position, okay? So they were clear that you could measure for instability in the neutral position, because we know when a spondylolisthesis is there greater than 3.5 millimeters, it's a weakened state. So it's a significant darn problem. And especially in the way the guides are interpreted, this may not be picked up. Now, obviously in the posterior tangent method of instability analysis, we are rating this. So what's nice about PostureRay is you have multiple methods of instability analysis, and based on your clinical opinion, you can apply what you need to, okay? So moving ahead. So our first adaptation comes with the AMA guides from the 5th edition. A lot of people still use this. What I want you to get from this whole thing is that clinically, if your state allows, you should be able to use whichever version of the guides that is indicative that you feel clinically for your patient for rating them. Now, I digress. Impairment ratings, if you're working like I did with a lot of trial attorneys, they don't care about impairment ratings, right? So ask me if I was asked to do impairment ratings for trial attorneys on cases that were going to trial. Well, I guess you can't ask me because this is a recording, right? The answer is emphatically no. They don't care about impairment ratings because these have a place, but in reality, they're kind of opinion and based on how things were done. So while it's a textbook, it's not the only authority on instability, obviously, right? So you as the clinician have to make an informed decision about your patient because your obligation is with the patient themselves. Your obligation is not to an attorney or to an insurance company. Your obligation as a doctor is to the patient. So you want to do the best you can for that patient and identify these problems so that way you can address them correctly in your practice to help them. So with that being said, here's the 3.5 millimeters. Okay, so it would be essentially 3.6 or greater, right? Or greater, 3.55, right? It's measured on flexion measured, extensions measured, and then what they do is the difference is taken. So basically called the translational excursion. When it's greater than 3.5 millimeters, the 5th edition classifies that as an instability. The angles are adjacent to one another. Now, this is something you really need to understand clearly in case you have to understand it, because I want you to get out of this that certain versions of instability analysis will flag different problems, just like if you measured a scoliosis with, say, a Cobb method of analysis versus the Reiser-Ferguson. Different values, different cutoffs, things like that. And so you got to understand as a clinician, as the expert, what this means. So this is, greater than 11 degrees. I'll show you in the diagram. The neutral is not rated, contrary to white and Punjabi, right? The extension is not rated, contrary to white and Punjabi. So you can say with my voice that I don't agree with this, but again, it's my opinion, right? So the way they do this, first off, is they're measuring end plates, which is a version of the Cobb analysis system. Problem with that is, and we go into this a lot, the reason why newer versions of spines, basically sagittal plane curves, which we published a 3-part series in Spine, which is pretty much one of the best journals in the world, orthopedically speaking, that this is erroneous for many reasons. First off, it's not the true curve of a slope. And I'll show you another diagram as we go in. But this is the way it was done in white and Punjabi and the way it was done in the guide. So you measure this angle between this joint, then you measure this angle, then you measure this angle. And you look to find what angle, is this angle greater than 11 degrees on this one, or is it greater than 11 degrees on that one? Okay, and so that is what we see here and classified greater than, at either adjacent segment as an instability. For translations, this is where I believe, again, this is the world according to me, Dr. Ferrantelli, and I can pretty much say Deed Harrison on that as well too, who is a real researcher. They took this in the 5th edition and are saying inflection or extension. So here it is. And I note on how I think they got that was misinterpreting what White and Punjabi wrote, right? When they said flexion through extension with a dash, it wasn't flexion minus extension. So measurements are obtained in flexion and extension, then difference is calculated. Greater than 2.5 millimeters of the thoracic spine, which, if you're measuring that. Greater than 4.5 millimeters in the lumbar spine, or greater than 3.5 millimeters in the cervical spine. So now, let's switch gears. The 6th edition, and I'm going to give you my commentary on this. I believe that there's some good things in the 6th edition. Absolutely. I believe they're trying to make up for their mistakes on the 5th edition too. And so one of the really good things that I believe is, even though the 3.5 millimeters is already accounting for magnification, that's something that you guys need to really clarify, because there's a lot of misinformation about how software needs to be done to account for millimeter displacements. 3.5 millimeters already accounts for that because it was done on plain film with a protractor, right? So that's already accounted for. So translational instability in 6th guides, they switch to percentages. Now, percentages are great because it's based on magnification doesn't apply, right? It's just comparing the offset of the vertebra. So greater than a 20% slippage forward, anterior or posterior on the flexion or extension. not flexion through extension. It's on the flexion film or on the extension. This is not cumulative movement. It's not the net movement of flexion to extension with linear translations as noted in the 5th edition. The angular motion is the same on this one as the 5th edition, again only rating flexion. And so this is from the 5th edition here. In the 6th edition, the only difference here is that they did a little better job with measuring. So they want you to measure the middle part of the body, get the averages. So I think they do a much better job. The thing that you have to keep in mind whenever you do translational movements, you do a plane on the end plate, and then you do a perpendicular up to that plane, right? So now you can start to see if there's a problem with the plane, and I always recommend you go with the disc plane line for obvious reasons, because if they had an avulsion chip fracture, that will change the angulation and make the vertebra above look more retrolisthesis than it normally would be, okay? So the way they did this is measure the A to P sagittal diameter, mid-level. Distance from A is compared to distance to B, determine the percentage, or distance in millimeters. You can do that as well, okay? And then you're gonna do the ratio or the slippage, the percentage, right? So I like that. Obviously, you can switch between this in PostureRay, okay? So now switching gears with lumbars, one of the things with lumbars, it's interesting. One of the problems, again, that I have for the guides, if you're gonna measure angles, why are you doing it differently in the cervical spine versus the lumbar spine, right? Just wanna let that sink in. I don't know who did this or what their methodology, what was their thinking when they did this, right? At least be consistent. Again, I digress. That's one of the reasons why in other systems, like with using posterior tangents, an angle is an angle, and we measure it the same way regardless of how the spine is done. Unfortunately, there is not an instability assessment for posterior tangent method for the lumbar spine at this time, but maybe shortly some more research will come out on that. So with the 5th edition of the guides, angles are calculated in flexion and extension and then subtracted. So at that angle, they're subtracted from flexion to extension. That's a big difference from the cervical spine. So the way they do this is at L1 through L4, 15 degrees is the cutoff. At L4-5, it's 20, and L5-S1 has to be greater than 25 degrees. Translational movements are noted as instability only when excursion exceeds the 4.5 millimeters in the flexion to extension, the net movement, okay? So if you look here, in the 5th edition, it's just the same as it was on in the cervical spine. So measurements are obtained in flexion and extension. The difference is calculated. Okay, so 4.5 millimeters in the lumbar spine. So it's a translational excursion, the net difference. The angle, it's a bit different. So you're measuring the angle in flexion to measure the angle in extension. Then what you're doing is, remember, a positive, when the spine is facing to the anterior to the left, a positive is a kyphotic value, a negative is a lordotic value, right? So if we look at a positive 8 degrees and subtract out the 18 degrees here, it's a 26 degree change, okay? So that's how they would define instability there. In the 6th edition, I think they do a much better job, again, using percentages, but now it's L1 through L5, 8% anterior or 9% posterior on flexion or extension x-rays. L5-S1 greater than 6% anterior or greater than 9% posterior translation of L5 on S1 on flexion or extension. Okay, I think that's very, very reasonable. If you look at it, it makes sense. I really do think the guides did a great job on the percentages using that, okay? Angles are measured the same as they were in the 5th edition, okay? So we got that down. Again, to rehash it, so in the 6th edition, this is the errata. So this is how they did it, again. And then the errata for this diagram, basically they just said take out the plus sign there. So with that being said, that's how the angulation is different on the lumbar spine. So you can see they're not consistent with how they do angles from the cervical spine to the lumbar spine. But again, it's the guides, right? So my inside baseball commentary, I just do this to be colorful, so it makes you think. Rest assured, I guarantee you on the next edition of the guides, they correct all these problems, I'm sure. I know some researchers that will probably be on those guides, and they've already talked with the other researchers, and they believe that these should be updated for sure. So where does the Harrison posterior tangent method come in? Well, this is something from Dr. Don Harrison that he introduced, which, well, Ruth Jackson only did C2 to C7. What's different with CBP and posterior tangent method, and we publish this in Spine as well as in JMPT, we're measuring every angle because this is that true slope of a curve and it's calculus. So we do this on all areas of the spine, segmentally known as relative rotational angles and absolute rotational angles, which are the endpoints. Okay. So with that being said, when I asked Dr. Harrison about this, it's a funny little story because he was a mentor of mine. He was truly a mathematician. I said, well, Don, why would this be different? And he said, well, first off, it's not a perfect square, right? So the end plates are not a perfect square. And mathematically, it's not calculus. And the end plates are often damaged, which is a real problem with Schmoll's nodes and limbus fractures and things like that. So it makes it hard to get a real true version of the slope of the curve. Whereas on this, you'll always measure the back of the body. And if there's a posterior osteophyte, you don't measure that. You measure, if you were putting a protractor up to the spine, how would you truly measure? It wouldn't be on, it truly wouldn't be on the spur. So when I asked him about this, me being a clinician and not a mathematician, he said, well, Joe, it's the posterior tangents or the slope of the curve, which is the first derivative in calculus, while the end plate, i.e. AMA guides method and Cobb, are a poor attempt at cross-section. The slope of the curvature is a measuring of the curvature, while the cross-sectional line does not measure the curvature. And he would always exemplify this with stories of eating pie, of course. So with that being said, that's the true math. And what's nice is that you can get a nice segmental picture when you measure all of these angles. And that's basically the relative rotational angles. So in CBP, this has been studied, and these are not these are in top journals. Spine is one of the best, and we did this a long time ago, starting in 2000. So this information has obviously been, if you do searches on anything spinal, many studies now that don't even know that chiropractors originated this are done using the posterior tangent method of analysis, which is pretty amazing, pretty awesome, right? That it's so well adopted in the orthopedic and neurosurgical literature, right? This because it's chiropractors that said that we should do this, albeit a chiropractor that was also an engineer and mathematician with Dr. Don Harrison. So he knew, and part of the backstory on this was he always knew there was a normal range for the spine. And he went back and got his PhD and his master's so he could get and understand how to write scientifically and to be able to get some of these papers into great journals like Spine. So you'll hear us talk about that at seminars. Well, even Griffiths and all in 1995 knew of this method of assessment. And so they wrote an interesting paper that shows using a posterior tangent method, an isolated kyphosis or kinking of two adjacent vertebral bodies greater than 10 degrees, or if you measure the spinuses is present on a lateral radiograph cervical spine, it's a presumptive diagnosis of a whiplash injury in approximately 80% of the cases. It's a great paper to have on file. And what I like about that is it's using the posterior tangent method. So here in PostureRay, you have yet another method of instability analysis. So you can be super thorough with your abilities to diagnose the possibility of ligamentous laxity in your patients. So they also showed that you could measure perpendiculars and measure the distance if you did it this way. You can use PostureRay in the annotation mode If you don't know how to do that, you can reach out to our support team and ask, how to do this. Basically, in the drawing mode, if you're using DICOM images or any other calibrated image, you can measure the true linear distances here. And yet that's another method of instability analysis. So greater than 12 millimeters would represent a problem, obviously. So a nice little summary here is in the CBP, posterior tangent method, we're going to rate 3.5 millimeters, right? We're going to rate it in flexion or extension, not cumulative. So that's the first thing to denote, is different with the report that has the posterior tangent method in it, called the impressions report. So you have that instability report, as well as if you have the quote-unquote instability report, which is the AMA guides method, you can generate either. And then you can generate which you want. What do you want to do? Do you want to do it in the 5th edition or the 6th edition? So something to keep in mind, total motion at a segment, and we go into this in the seminar, so don't ask me for the citations on this unless you plan on going to the seminars. And then you can ask Dr. Harrison. So greater than 23 degrees of movement from flexion to extension using the posterior tangent method is a good cutoff value for global instability, or I should say segmental instability at C2 down to C7. Okay, so when you measure the posterior tangent method, C2 to C7 on flexion then extension. Now this is kind of hard to do on your own, so obviously software is the key to this. So I already reviewed some of this, but I want to drive this point home. When digitizing or marking by plain film, we want to measure perpendicular, or I should say the end plate line, then perpendicular to that. Then what you do is you measure from a parallel line from above. Oh, let me go backwards, sorry. Measure and drop that line down. So you can see if in this dotted line, if we did it on where this little deformity is, right, and not the disc plane line, that dotted line now is perpendicular here. So the retro, if I drop a parallel line down from the vertebra above down, you're going to see that it looks more like a retrolithesis if this is on an angle, right? So what I recommend you do is you always digitize to accommodate the disc plane line, right? That is what really makes sense. Okay, because the vertebrae are stacking on the disc, not are they, the disc level, the vertebra above, unless it was a complete compression deformity on a complete angle, then that's the time that it would make sense to measure that end plate, right? But if it's like this, you got the whole end plate up here, and that's just a little deformity, right? So with that being said, also don't digitize the bone spurs, right? So if you came down, if they had, imagine a big posterior osteophyte here, you would always do in line, like right here, you would do always in line with the vertebra. Okay, moving ahead, yet another instability analysis found in PostureRay is called Penning's. If you're an older doctor, you probably already know about this. It came out a long time ago. And there's a lot of good papers representing that this is a good, valid method of instability analysis. This too should be in the guides for impairment ratings. It's not. I don't understand why. There's a lot that's not in the guides. Lateral bending to AP open mouth for alar and accessory ligament damage. It's ligament damage. Why didn't they highlight that in the AMA guides? They knew full and well. Here's another assessment tool, right? So this paper, you can get it. It's just do a PubMed on Penning. You can download it. Basically, what we're doing is we're taking what was then plain X-ray, superimposing one vertebra, and then marking the angle using the side of the X-ray to the edge of the other X-ray as the measure of total flexion to total extension with the vertebra above. Right? The way that looks is this. And obviously you can't do this nowadays, right? You can't do this type of templating nowadays because it's all digital. So thank God PostureRay does this for you. So you superimpose the vertebra and then you move it, and as you go, you can generate the angles based on of what vertebra you're using as the control to measure, right? It's pretty genius. Incidentally, this is really the posterior tangent method that Penning's is using, because they're doing posterior tangents of the side of the film, right? Pretty cool. Smart guys back then. So if you look at Penning, published this first in 1960. There's been many other studies after that. So that's why we put that in there. And by the way, there's another video. If you don't want to show Penning's assessment, which right now is in the instability report, you can shut that off if you want to. Just a good summary of this. So greater than 23 degrees using the posterior tangent method. 11 degrees, we covered that. So now you know the differences in percentages in millimeters. You know the limitations of the 5th edition, 6th edition. You know the differences between Penning's, and you know the difference between posterior tangent method. If you need more clarification, what I suggest you do is take the ICA Whiplash Trauma Series, and also take the CBP Whiplash course as well too, where this goes into a lot more in depth. Okay. Because I know Dr. Dan Murphy's no longer doing his course, and neither is Art Croft. So those are obviously, I'm a little bit biased because we also teach for the ICA. But it's a fantastic course. It really is. So what I want to do is I want to exemplify what you're going to see clinically in practice. And I'm going to use a DMX on this one, which obviously PostureRay does. Now, what I want to show you is where I think the AMA Guides makes a tragic error using the 5th edition. Okay, so in the static position, you can see this is a significant spondylo, right? All right, so the guides in the 5th edition is going to say, hey, there's no problem here, right? Because they're going to say that spondy isn't moving all that much. So since it's not moving all that much, then we're not going to classify this as a significant problem. Now, any researcher looks at this and saying, or a surgeon looks at this and saying, are you out of your mind? Any additional trauma, this is a huge weakened area in the spine. It's an instability. It's just not moving yet anymore. But guess what? It takes a way less threshold of injury forces to move that segment than it will other segments, right? So what the guides do, it's a little interesting, right? Using the posterior tangent method, we're going to measure that. And we're going to say, hey, 4.5 millimeters forward, extension, it reduces a little bit to 3.8 millimeters. That's a problem. That's something we should quantify. Also, we measure C5-6 at one angle, more than 11 degrees, and more than 11 degrees here at one angle. Okay, so know that the angles are going to be slightly different in this versus the end plate method because we're measuring different parts of the vertebra. And differently, we're going to come up with different thresholds because it's comparing, in the end plate, you'll see how it compares. It's comparing the joint above to the joint below. Here, and I got to belabor this point a little more because every one of you have this question. Because you don't know, nobody's ever explained to you the differences. So here I am going to explain this just on flexion, C5, C6, not comparing to C4 to C5, and it's not comparing to C6, C7. Okay? So that's how the posterior tangent method's different. And it's actually the true slope of the curve. Mathematically, this is the one that makes sense. Hopefully, in a future version of the guides, knowing that I know some of the researchers that are hopefully going to contribute to this, they will put this into the AMA Guides as a method of analysis. It only makes sense, especially that it's been documented in spine as the preferred over Cobb, at least in the sagittal plane curves, that it's superior. So why not use this for instability method of analysis too? And they'll probably correct, making that it's not cumulative. This is where you get into problems. Looking at, if I turn on the 5th edition and measure this, everything's green, nothing to see here. Look at the table of values. Wait a minute, that's greater than 3.5 millimeters. That's greater than 3.5 millimeters. Something's wrong with PostureRay. No, nothing's wrong with PostureRay. It's because the 5th edition only does translational excursion for instability analysis. That's 0.7 of a millimeter. Therein lies my big problem with the 5th edition of the guides. Okay, this is the world according to Joe. Use it as you will, you know. But this is why I think the AMA guides did a lousy job here. Okay, so let's see what happens with the same case when we switch it to the 6th edition. 6th edition, same spine. What's going on here, right? So percentages classify in flexion or extension. So now we have an instability noted on the 6th edition that was missed in the 5th edition. So you as a doctor, you have to really go the extra mile and decide and have a reasonable understanding on how, if you're going to interpret impairment ratings, how are you going to interpret them in your narrative report and explain it to the attorney if you're questioned or if you're deposed? You have to own this material for the sake of your patient. Honestly, I could give a damn about a trial. I mean, I don't care about, I care about what's best for the patient, right? You should be doing this, in my opinion, on every patient that you have flexion extension on, regardless if it was a PI case, workers' comp, who cares? If it was a cash, Medicare, or if it was a free case to a relative, to know is to measure on x-ray. If you don't measure it on x-ray, you're missing it. Because sure as heck, your eyeball's not going to catch this, right? So the AMA guides caught that. Now, in that same report, we're going to have the pennings. Now, you can turn this on or off. You know what this is now. And so we put some other papers in here as well, too. But these are pennings values, normal values. You can choose to report it in your narrative report if you want to. So there you are. You can choose to do that. Pennings assessment. So technically, you have a lot at your disposal. You have the posterior tangent method, you have pennings, you have the 5th edition and the 6th edition interpretation of your patient's spine. So I wanted to find a good lumbar case. So this is a good example in a lumbar with these methods. So they have a spondy. Doesn't appear that it's moving too much. So the 5th edition says, hey, nothing to see here. I say that very sarcastically, right? Hopefully you get my dry sense of humor with this. Someone that's been involved with research, I don't know if this was an agenda on their part or not. I think honestly it was just a problem that they had. They didn't know. They weren't engineers. They weren't real spine biomechanists, right? They might have been and still are maybe great surgeons, but that's why this was accidentally done this way. Again, contrary to White and Punjabi on some of the things that they do. But here is, what we're gonna identify what the problems are here. So they have a spondy, okay? So what we're gonna do is now let's go ahead and see, where this at. Because look right here, 8.1 millimeters. Not a problem. Are you out of your stinking mind? It reduces only to 7.4 millimeters. Gives me a 0.7 of a millimeter difference. Are you telling me that that's a nice spine that if this is a person that does normal activities, do you think I should, does it make a difference? Of course it does, right? This segment, this area of the spine is set up for future injury at a much lower threshold because of this. For the 5th edition not to classify this as a problem is very erroneous in my personal opinion. Always put that caveat there. But if you're going to use the AMA guides, hey, know what you're dealing with, right? 5th edition, there you go. Okay? Hopefully you can laugh at some of my humor as I go through this. It's a dry sense of humor, but I want you to know the truth here. I get a little more colorful during the regular lectures. I guess I channel a little Don Harrison in me. So with this, now we switch to the 6th edition of the guides. Now we see a problem. Same spine, but now the difference is how we rate and interpret the measurements. Okay, so now using the 6th edition, it's over the threshold using percentages, right? So with that being said, it's measured in flexion or extension. So the segmental translation is more than flexion or extension. You can see the angles didn't move all that much, right? So those angles aren't, you're going to have a huge instability if you see more of an angle problem, but that you don't see a spondy. But with that being said, with these translational movements, there's your problem. Much bigger than 6%, much bigger than 9%. So if what my advice is to you is, if your state allows and you're requested to do impairment ratings, well, first off, my advice to you is deal with attorneys that take cases to court, because that's the best thing for your patient. Having an attorney settle for a case where you really need to go much further with them. That's why later on in practice, I only wanted to deal with trial attorneys, because I felt like it was a disservice to work with an attorney that was just, going through the motions. This is something that it's a major issue, right? So hopefully this, presentation opened your eyes a little bit. Hopefully I made you laugh a little bit with my colorful perspective on some of this. I really wanted to drive the point home about how to use PostureRay and choose what method of assessment you're going to report. Now, world according to me, I gave the attorneys and insurance companies and anybody who requested records all of it. I gave them the patient report, I gave them the instability report, which is the end plate, and I gave them the posterior tangent method. And then in my narrative report, the key is in my narrative, that's when I went in and I was verbose about how I rated these problems. And if it was, say, ALR or accessory ligament damage on a lateral bending AP open mouth, right, on a DMX, or that we verified in an upright MRI, because I was doing that back when I was in practice in the late 2000s. I was doing this stuff when we had the first Phonar MRI unit up in Tampa, Florida. We were doing these things. So with that being said, know the guides in case you're questioning on them. Know the differences between the methods. Be ready to be able to address those if you're ever questioned on, doctor, why are these measurements different in your report? You should handle that in your narrative report, okay? Narrative is where I went into everything, okay? And my last bit of advice, the world according to me, is I did this on any set of x-rays that I had on the patient, regardless of how they paid. Personal injury is only how they pay for their care, right? The patient is still the same as a cash patient. Their rehab, their treatment mechanisms, everything that you should do, all your documentation should be no different for a cash patient or a free patient or a workers' comp or general insurance or a PI patient. All your documentation, man, it should be all the same. And there's more that goes into an impairment rating than just what you see on x-rays. So I implore you to actually learn how to do impairment ratings correctly if you're going to do them. Take a course, learn how to do it. Even if we don't agree with how the guides did this, maybe in the 8th edition of the guides, they'll have this updated, right? So with that being said, I just want to draw your attention to something else in PostureRay, and hopefully you can see this. I want to generate a report because on a sample case. So in a report, I show how to switch between the versions of the AMA guides. But I just want to bring your attention to this. Let me just shut this off again here. Selection, hit view. And so what we're going to do here is when I go into, I'll just go into the instability report. I want you to be aware of to actually read the reports, okay? So if you have any questions on what is in a table, all you got to do is come down here and read it, okay? So it's pretty self-explanatory once you read it. So if you were ever in a case where you forgot what it meant, just read the report, because this text is an interpretation of those tables, okay? So I wanted to draw that attention to you. Make sure you watch the other videos on this page. Any questions, you can feel free to reach out to us, obviously at support. I can't do clinical interpretation. I'm not going to do that for you guys because we have lots of users and it would be a full-time job if I did second opinions. So I'm not doing that. There are plenty of great doctors out there that do. There's also some great avenues for education. Again, I implore you to go through the ICA trauma series that they have, that they offer every year. It's a fantastic course. And then consider the CBP Whiplash Trauma course as well. Okay. And that's it. Hopefully you enjoyed this presentation. If any of you have any questions, just reach out to us. You can reach us at support@PostureRay.com. Thanks, guys. Take care.